Hi, this is Steve Hargadon, and welcome to the opening keynote of our inaugural Future of Museums conference. We are especially pleased to welcome Elizabeth Merritt, who is not only the co-chair of the conference, but she's the founding director of the American Alliance of Museums Center for the Future of Museums. No better speaker to kick us off. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. I'm so glad to be here today. So are we all set to go, or are there any other?
Yes, really delighted. Not yet.
Okay.
Let me get through a couple of slides here quickly.
Okay.
So thanks to New Media Consortium and the Center for the Future of Museums for helping us pull this event off. This is really fun. First time event. Very excited about the collaborative potential of the museums as a part of our larger vision of the learning professions, the Learning Revolution project. And thanks to Blackboard Collaborate for this platform. This is a chance for those of you who are in the virtual room to indicate where you're participating from. Look to the left of the map for the icons. The second one down is a star. And click on that. You have to click on it twice and then click on the map to indicate where you're participating from. It's also fun for us to have you put your information in the chat box as well. Your location, maybe the time and the temperature. Looks like Belgium is back. So excited for international attendees, of course. Peggy's looking for Alaska, or she's reading Looking for Alaska? Danielle, you raised your hand. If that means you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. Or if you were looking for the star icon, it's to the left of the map. And it's the second icon down in the vertical bar of icons. I'm going to move us forward from the map, but please feel free to keep posting your location in the chat. Elizabeth, I'll turn the time over to you, and when you want me, I'll be ready.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Steve. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm particularly pleased to be cooperating with Steve on this conference because the future of education is one of the main focuses both of the Center for the Future of Museums right now and for the Alliance of Museums. Since we're seeing a lot of forecasting that suggests that the future of the educational system in the U.S. is going to be very different than it was in the last century. And we're seeing a lot of hints that museums could play a far deeper and more central role in the educational system of the 21st century. So it becomes a fertile area for exploration. Now, my role today is going to be to set the stage for the great keynotes and sessions you'll be hearing throughout the day. But starting by providing some context for thinking about the future. So I'm going to start us out in a Museum of the Future. This is a picture I found that the Science Museum of London posted back in 2009 on the occasion of their centennial when they put forth their vision for the future museum that was going to open in 2015. I love centennials because when people are celebrating 100 years of history, they usually are thinking quite deeply about what they think they're going to be in the next 100 years. So this is our background for our exploration of the future today. And the first thing that I want to start us out with thinking about is the nature of future studies and of forecasting. Now, for those of you who haven't heard me speak before, I'll start out with my traditional first line, which is tremendously important, which is that future studies is not about predicting the future, which may seem counterintuitive. So I've put up here my favorite diagram of future studies, which is the cone of plausibility, illustrating the fact that what we're looking for is not one point in the future that we think is going to happen, but a whole area within which we think there are plausible futures. Our job as futurists, when we bring this to our work, is to think about all the ways that the future might be different than the present so that we don't get locked into one vision and then find that we actually were aiming in the wrong direction and the plans that we formed didn't take us to the right place in time. And I'm going to illustrate that with a couple of examples. So if back in 1990, I was a real fan of Star Trek, and yes, you can say in chat if you were a fan of Star Trek and which was your favorite part of the series. Mine was Deep Space Nine. And in Deep Space Nine, they had one plot where Odo was accused of murder. And it turns out that, in fact, someone did die, but it was a clone. It was a clone. It was not the original person. And they had this little vision of how you would grow a cloned human being in the future of Star Trek. Well, that might have seemed at that point, back in 1990, as being entirely outside the cone of plausibility. It was science fiction. But here we are in 2014, and what do I read in the news? Someone has actually created a 3D printed human ear using cartilage cells as the base. And people are, in fact, starting to experiment with printing with working functional cells from things like livers. So if you project this trend of actually being able to manipulate human cells to create functioning organs, you can imagine a time in 2035 when maybe, in fact, we could print a functional 3D printed human heart that could be used for transplant, which of course would have the phenomenal advantage that you wouldn't have to take anti-rejection drugs. So there's an example, looking at how things have been changing over the past couple of decades, things that are happening now, and projecting forward to see what that might look like in the future. What sort of future could be created by a trend shaping the future landscape? In museum studies, we're looking at a broad range of areas for these trends and signals. We're looking at the social and cultural landscape. We're looking at technology, of course. We're looking at the environment. We're looking at the economy. We're looking at politics and policy, and all of those things interweave to influence each other. Some of the ways that I look for information and share information when I'm trying to discern these trends are, for example, what the future might look like. Imagery is tremendously important, so I'm always scanning my news feeds to look for pictures of how people have seen things that might signal a potential future. And I pin those, by the way, to the Pinterest boards that CFM keeps. And I think Steve could drop in a link to CFM Pinterest boards. So those are little glimpses of what the future might look like. The other thing I do is I read a lot of stories related to these trends, and I'll often drop a quick link to a story into Twitter. So that's a great place to keep an eye on what I'm reading. And then I start trying to interpret what I'm seeing. So this is where you'll see essays on the CFM blog where I start to say, so what? What does it mean when I see these images? What do these stories all add up to? And then the big annual roll-up of the so what, which is Trends Watch. So we're taking a look at a year's worth of news and saying, what are the patterns we saw? What are the trends that really seem to be accelerating the past year? How is that changing the world? What are museums doing to respond, and what might they think about doing in the future? Personally, I'd love it if you shared in the chat window whether you use any of these resources and how, because I'm continually looking for feedback about how to share what I'm seeing and how to help make sense of it for the field. So today we're going to be looking at how trends are shaping potential futures for museums. And we are focusing on technological trends. And the four that we've picked out from the Horizon report are location-based services, crowdsourcing, bring your own device, and makerspaces. But I'm going to tell you a little secret. It's never really about the technology. These things seem very shiny and attractive and easy to see because they're new, because there's something you can buy and put in your pocket. But in fact, any technology is really just enabling and amplifying social and cultural trends that are showing the way people want to behave. So technology, for technology's sake, never takes off. It becomes a trending item because it fills a deep human need. And in fact, that need may be filled in non-technological ways, which is one of the things I'm going to explore in the talk today. But just quickly, let's take a look at those 4 trends, since that's going to be the focus of the agenda for the rest of the day. The first is location-based technology, location-aware technology. So the fact that there are so many different ways today that you can know where you are, for example, the little GPS unit in your cell phone, and in fact, other applications can know you are there. So you can link locations and data with contextual information. So that picture that you're seeing now is the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. They were closed for a while. The museum was closed for renovation. But by creating an art tours project using the AR browser Layar, what they could do is project their content out into the city so that as people were moving around the city, they could use an augmented reality app on their phone to pull in historic photographs, for example, from the museum's collection, and layer that over what they were seeing in the real world. So that's a great example of how location-aware technology enabled a museum to get outside its walls and deliver museum content in a contextually appropriate way. And that's something we're seeing a lot of. Another trend that we're seeing is crowdsourcing. Public work, volunteer work, public input. 2 of the projects that I've mentioned in the past year are this fabulous example from the Smithsonian. They had an ichthyology team out in Guyana collecting fish, and they were fabulously successful. They collected 5,000 fish. They were so unexpectedly successful, they had no idea how they were going to identify the fish to fill out the paperwork you need to do to get the fish into the U.S. So somebody had the brilliant idea of simply sitting there with a cell phone and taking a picture of each specimen and uploading it to the web and saying to volunteer ichthyologists around the world, help us identify these fish. What the heck is this? Which got them identified quickly enough, at least to the level that they could fill out the import paperwork. Somewhat less specialized and geeky, you have projects like the University of Alabama Library's Tag It project, where anybody can log on and start trying to put appropriate identifying tags on digital materials to make it possible for other people to find it easily. Now in this case, those first 2 trends, notice, it's not just about the technology. The location-based services builds on people's desire to know something about where they are now instead of having to wait and look it up when they get home. On-demand, immediate information. Crowdsourcing, everybody wants to participate. People want to help. They don't want to just be passive recipients of information. They love to get their hands on the stuff and help out. Which leads us to makerspaces, the ultimate hands-on experience. This is the New York Hall of Science. We spent quite an amount of time yesterday talking about makerspaces. And this is building on, again, that same trend of people wanting to participate, wanting to do instead of just view, and also a trend in education that finds that immersive participatory self-directed learning is in many ways more effective as a way of getting across concepts. So makerspaces are a way of filling people's desire to get their hands on and craft, part of the whole my culture that's building up of wanting to do things and make things, sometimes for sale, which led to the rise of Etsy, which is the home of thousands of people creating both tech and low-tech, like knitted and crocheted objects. And a proliferation of spaces where people can go in public shared spaces, whether in museums or otherwise, to get their hands on cool equipment and confab with like-minded people and trade skills. Another trend that we're going to look at throughout the day is the trend of bringing your own device. So it used to be that museums had to create all of their own platforms delivering information, notably the exhibit label. And as we moved into digital ways of delivering information, we still sometimes presumed that we had to provide the device. So originally we had like audio guides. You came and checked them out and rented them when you got to the museum. There wasn't a presumption people would bring something they could use for you to stream the information to. Now people are walking in with Android phones, iPhones, iPads. This exemplifies, first of all, people's desire for control over their own personal technology, and also, frankly, their control over the museum experience. What you're seeing right now is a little illustration of a DIY augmented reality art invasion at MoMA, which was part of the Conflux Festival. Now, the notable thing about this little augmented reality intervention, so you had an app and you could look at art that wasn't actually in the gallery, but if you entered the gallery, you'd get a feed of what they were projecting into the gallery, is it wasn't sanctioned by the museum. So a couple of artists went out and designed this and said they were doing it, but it was without asking the permission of MoMA. So you not only are losing control over what device people want to use, but to a large extent this is then fueling a trend in which museums don't have control over the content either. So very disruptive trends shaping the future of education, of museums. Okay, let's take a look now. We're going to take, as promised, a brief visit to the future. It's going to be 2030, and we're going to pay a visit to 3 potential future museums that I invented, I admit that, but I'm starting with the premise that every plausible future has a toehold in the present. So as we go through this visit, I'm going to be citing real examples from the current news, things that I've helped report on in the last couple of years, to lay the groundwork for why I'm saying this is a plausible potential future, why it exists within that cone of plausibility. So the first museum we're going to visit is the Quantified Museum. And the Quantified Museum is building on what is being called right now the quantified self movement, which is beginning to gain steam. The phrase was coined, I believe, by Gary Wolfe, who gave a really popular TED Talk a couple of years ago. He's an editor of Wired. And it's a movement that incorporates technology into the service of self-improvement by obsessive monitoring of inputs like food and states of mind like mood and performance like exercise and sleep. Some people call it life logging. This is my little jawbone up band, just to show that I'm part of the quantified self movement. So this is made possible by the rise of 2 things: cheap, powerful internet-connected devices, so like my phone, which has more computing power, by the way, than the computer that powered the Apollo spacecraft. Wearable tech like my little biomonitoring band. Oh, by the way, if you're wearing one, just put a little note in chat and say, yeah, I'm wearing a little biomonitoring band. If it's Jawbone Up or Fitbit, let's see how many people out there are plugged into the quantified self movement. So these personal devices are part of a larger environment that's been dubbed the Internet of Things. So it's the massive amount of interconnected web-based data that includes things like stores doing GPS tracking of cell phone signals, or things like the Jawbone tracking device. It includes the fact that people are now creating ways to track where people are and how they move through public spaces. So for example, this is an illustration of the Disney Magic Band. And this is what Disney is phasing into its theme parks to replace physical ticketing, or at least to supplement it. Because with a Magic Band, people can not only get in, prepay, and indicate what it is they want to do, but they can receive personalized information through their phone about the best times to do those things, because they might get a message saying, for example, this ride you wanted to ride on, the line's really short, so now would be the time for you to go there. It can also provide creepy personalizations depending on how much information you want to share. So for example, if you've put in your profile and your birthday and age and who you're coming with, you might find that Minnie walks up to you and leans down to your 6-year-old and says, "Hi Emma, I know it's your birthday and I'm your favorite character." Yes, so the creepy excesses of the Internet of Things. We have stores tracking our progress through the store because they can pick up our cell phone signal, and therefore they know where we are and where we're going. They can even use eye tracking and facial recognition to know what we're looking at in the store and to profile us to some extent. Am I young, female, older, male? And they can tailor the store environment to the data they're getting. So for example, control the sales force, who they have out on the floor, what kind of music they're playing. They can even begin to detect mood. So facial recognition is getting good enough that you can tell whether people are generally happy or unhappy. Create real-time feedback. So all of this massive amount of information feeds into what's being called big data. Big data. It's called big because by 2012, people were creating 2.8 zettabytes of information a year. And this is projected to double by 2015. So a zettabyte, just for context, is 2 to the 70th power bytes. Jasper had a great slide in his keynote yesterday, graphically illustrating the fact that 90% of all the data in the world has been generated in the last 2 years. 90% of the capturable data, anyway. The other thing fueling this trend is the fact that increasingly we have the analytic power to make sense of all this data. So in 2011, IBM Watson caught our attention by beating the human champions, Ken Jennings and Brad Rutter, at Jeopardy! And this was just a prologue to the real work of this artificial cognitive computing system that was created by IBM. Watson's ability is to be able to understand questions posed in natural language, mine huge data sets on the web, and learn from interacting with that data. And you can harness this ability. So, for example, they're creating a healthcare Watson that can improve diagnosis and treatment decisions, a Wall Street Watson to give advice on investment choices and trading patterns. Most recently, they've launched a chef Watson that if you tell it what ingredients you want to work with, it looks at the web at all the permutations of what seems to work, and it suggests a de novo recipe that it's created for you. I haven't actually tried one of those yet, but I'd love to sign up to do that. This is being harnessed in real-world ways, for example, for predictive policing. So predictive policing, looking at crime patterns, looking at demographics, even things like weather. Are people going to be cranky because it's hot? Are there going to be a lot of people in a certain area because of a festival? And telling the police, maybe you want to put more people on the ground here because there's a high probability that crime will occur. So it's sort of like Minority Report come to life. All of these trends are also coming to a head when we see a rising desire on the part of donors, particularly the 40-somethings who are millennials back in 2012, to want proof of impact of their giving. So we're living in 2030 now. Remember, we've launched into the future, and our major donor base are people who grew up in an era in which they knew they could get proof of their giving, because there are metrics that can be collected and delivered about what resulted from any kind of work. They expect nonprofits to say, because you gave me this money, I can give you this metric of how I changed the world with your support. And people are talking about high-impact philanthropy. They're tailoring their dollars to where they can get a real result. So this Quantified Museum we're visiting in 2030 is being shaped by all of these trends. Now, one of the cool things that's happened now in 2030 is we've gotten over this disadvantage that museums had back in the ancient 2010s. We've gotten over the barrier to collecting really good data on our performance that used to hold us back. It used to be that the only way you could really measure the kinds of impact we'd like to be able to measure for museums, how their life is better because of the arts, their health, their happiness, their life status, was the sole provenance of longitudinal research studies like the old Nurses' Health Study or the Framingham Health Study at the end of the 20th century that enrolled thousands of people in decades-long studies to track the effects of diet and exercise and personal habits like smoking and health. But museums never used to have the capacity to gather this kind of quantitative data that would yield results about impact on cultural behavior. Now, courtesy of the intersection of the Internet of Things, big data, and the quantified self movement, we do. So when you enter the Quantified Museum, you actually receive an electronic internet-connected wristband instead of a ticket. It's like the Disney Magic Bands. And by 2030, the modern version of these bands track biometric data like pulse and galvanic skid response, and if coupled with data gathered from the museum's ubiquitous video feeds analyzed by facial recognition and emotion analysis software, we not only know where in the museum a visitor is, but how long they spend there and what they look at and how they respond. So a primitive precursor of this can be seen as far back as 2013, when the Dallas Museum of Art implemented its DIA Friends membership system, in which you traded a free membership in return for personal data. So you check in an exhibits via text messaging, and it's cross-indexed against the census data by zip code, so it provides a very powerful analytic data, both about individual attendees like Bobby here, so you know when he came to the museum very frequently, and how he interacted and what kinds of badges and rewards he was collecting. and a more general demographic profile of the overall visitation of the museum. So this made donors very happy because foundations could say, with our support, we can see you're broadening your demographic base and having a deeper impact on people who are visiting more frequently and engaging in more meaningful ways. Another experiment in early data mining of visitors was the analysis of tweets generated by visitors to the Art in Action exhibit at the Tate Modern in 2012. Not only did they collect and share tweets generated by visitors, they performed sentiment analysis of the pulled tweets to characterize how people reacted to the exhibit. I think the best early precursor to our 2030 abilities to analyze how museums are creating reactions at our visitors is the 2008 eMotion research project, which used something called psychogeography to map the museum experience. So they equipped visitors. You can see here it was a very primitive version of our current attendance bands. They had sensor gloves that measured heart rates and electrical resistance of the skin, and combined with indoor GPS, it mapped visitors' physical reactions to the art they're visiting. This is one of the early toeholds I'm talking about. This is a real project. The eMotion project really took place in 2008, and I'm projecting that by 2030, when you combine it with advances in technology about monitoring, facial recognition, quantified data collection devices, we'll be able to, in a more sophisticated and seamless way, collect data about how people are interacting with our museum. And then what do we do with it? Well, so in 2030, the Quantified Museum is the first museum in the U.S. to collect all of these data streams from visitors and integrate them with other data from out in the world, health, education, and life activities. And they generate a big data picture of how interacting with the arts in general, and this museum in particular, impact people over time. So here's a conceptual drawing of a similar project taking place right now to integrate big data to quantify health gains. So what makes this future likely or unlikely? Well, some of the things that make it likely are the documented evidence of the experiments that I've named today. You can see retail experimenting with very sophisticated data collection, including facial recognition monitoring, emotion detection. You can see little museum projects beginning to bring that into our realm as well, saying, can we track where people are in the museum? Can we give them voluntary ways to tell us what they're doing and how they're feeling about it? I think the biggest barrier to this future is going to be concerns over privacy, because just as I said that the Disney Magic Band can get kind of creepy, people are obviously very concerned right now about how much information they're putting out there, how they're sharing it, and how people are using it. I think it's somewhat more likely that they'll have fewer concerns about privacy with trusted public institutions like museums, but we have to see how this plays out in the next few years. And of course, it's tremendously influenced by anything that goes wrong in other realms. When the government has data leaks, when a store is caught doing something nefarious with data, then everybody's concern is heightened, and it reduces the ability of even well-meaning players in the nonprofit realm to take advantage of these trends. Okay, so that was our little visit to the Quantified Museum in 2030. Okay, next visit. Go down the street to the next museum, which some of you may be relieved to find is the Disconnected Museum, a place of respite and retreat. So the second museum evolves in response to our hyper-connected, intrusive world. In 2030, we're living in a world saturated with online devices, and increasingly we not only feel chained to these devices, we're beginning to feel that they're part of a network of surveillance that gives us no privacy. So this is the museum that I created, with a presumption that maybe those privacy concerns and a fatigue with digital connectedness actually could create a pushback against the fully integrated digital museum. So it's a completely offline, no-tech, highly personalized, multisensory museum. But remember I said, technology trends are never just about technology. So even this disconnected offline museum has been shaped by cultural expectations that were in turn shaped by the technologies in the outside world. So all of these things that shaped the Quantified Museum still have changed the cultural consciousness and expectations of cultural consumers. And they'll bring those expectations to the Disconnected Museum as well. So how is it going to fill those expectations in an offline, analog way? First of all, let's just point out that to try and disconnect people from this digital world, the museum itself is buffered from the surrounding city by a thick wall of greenery. And to set the stage, they make sure that they're not near any of the ubiquitous surveillance cameras in the area. You know that nobody's going to see you going in. And what they do when you arrive at the parking lot is they provide you with a very low-tech, fun, personalized way of making it the rest of the way to the museum so that the cars aren't actually driving up to the front. Does this actually happen? Actually, this is a picture of the happening couch at the Santa Cruz Museum of Art. I have seen several other museums experimenting with whimsical conveyances. Of course, if we also have the obesity trend taking place in the U.S., it may be harder and harder to have these be human-powered devices, but okay. So you get into the museum, and you find yourself in a no Wi-Fi zone. No Wi-Fi zones became a thing almost as soon as Wi-Fi became a thing. This is a picture of an experiment that really happened back in, I think this was 2012, when KitKat ran a promotion campaign. This is in Amsterdam, where so many cool things seem to happen. And what they did is they went and they found areas where there were natural gaps in Wi-Fi coverage. And they just put up a sign and said, free no Wi-Fi zone, so that people knew when they sat down there they could talk to people and not worry about them just staring at their phone and their email. So this already, back in 2012, was feeding people's desire to have more personal offline experiences where they could focus on human interaction. Now, we are actually building on a trend to enforce this by creating intentional no Wi-Fi zones. So the museum is in a giant Faraday cage. It doesn't let any Wi-Fi signals in. Does this have a toehold in the past? Yes, absolutely. I was just reading last week about the Faraday Cafe that opened. It was a 2-day art experiment, I think. Or was it 2 weeks? Anyway, a short-term pop-up art experiment where they turned a cafe into a no Wi-Fi zone by creating a giant Faraday cage around it and advertising the fact that if you came in, you would have a non-digital offline experience. So our disconnected museum has applied this learning in 2030, and you couldn't use a digital device in the museum if you wanted to. Once you're in, the museum is relentlessly low-tech. There's no wayfinding app. There's no augmented reality. In some gallery, there aren't even any labels, which, again, building on a reality of the present, this is the St. Johnsbury Athenaeum in Vermont, which itself looks like it was 100 years old. One of the most popular times to visit the museum is Meditation Mondays, when complete silence is observed. You're asked to please not talk in the museum. This is an actual meditation class that took place last year at the El Segundo Museum of Art. But even on Mondays, sketching is highly encouraged, just as it's been in the past. This is a sketching day at the De Young Museum. Well, while you can't rent an Acoustiguide, you can check out a musician, a poet, or a perfumier to accompany you through the museum, creating a personalized soundtrack, wordscape, or smellscape, so that you can have an enhanced multisensory experience without digital intervention. This is a picture of the Machine Project Museum Soundtrack project at the Hammer Museum in LA. Finally, you can stop on your way out at the cafe to select a snack that reflects the works you enjoyed viewing that day. You can even work with a rotating resident chef to create an original work you feel encapsulates your experience. So these Modrian cakes are from SF MoMA. Well, remember I'm saying technology shapes expectations, even if you're going to fill them in an analog way. One of the really interesting technologies I'm looking at right now is digital scent technology. So right now, the American Museum of Natural History is hosting one of 2 worldwide demonstrations of the O-phone, which is a technology created by researchers at Harvard who have created digital scent messaging, so a way to send digital scent messages. Right now, it's fairly simple. There are only a certain number of scents you can send, and you're having to compose them yourself if you're doing it from your iPhone. But what if this technology becomes refined, as I'm sure it will? Maybe you actually can digitally record a scent and digitally send a scent. That's going to change people's expectations about how they capture and document and share experiences. So just like now, people, when they go to a museum, expect to be able to hold up their cell phone and take a photo and send the photo or send a selfie to their friends to say I was here, they may expect to be able to take a digital recording, saying, wow, I was at the Botanic Garden and the cactus smelled wonderful. Here's what it is. Let me share that. Or when I got a tour of collection storage at the Natural History Museum, you won't believe what that smelled like. It was incredible and weird. That expectation doesn't have to be met digitally, even if it was fueled by a digital development in the past decade. So, for example, I'm saying that at this museum, the offline disconnected museum, if you want to create a sent record of your visit to the museum, either a literal one or one that catches your impressions. You know, here's a scent that captures how I felt when I was in the 20th century portrait gallery. You can work with a personalized perfumier, the resident perfumier, to create your scent and either have a limited batch created for your friends, or you in fact could sell it online. Though the museum doesn't like to get into the digital marketplace themselves. It doesn't fit their philosophy and mission. So that was a brief visit to the disconnected museum. A museum that, even if it was shaped by the expectations that technology helped fuel in the last couple of decades, here in 2030 they're consciously turning their back on technology and filling those expectations in a relentlessly offline analog way. Could happen. Go to Plausibility. This is in there somewhere. Okay, last visit. Hope you haven't got museum fatigue yet. At least you're not having to stand on a hard marble floor. Our last visit to a museum in 2030 is going to be to the distributed museum. And you'll see as we go through this little scenario why I call it that. So the distributed museum actually has very long historical antecedents. In 2030, it's 150 years old. It's a pretty traditional museum. It actually, starting in 2029, just give you a little description here, it had a nice collection. The whole museum was devoted to just exhibit galleries, storage, and conservation. They had a second building that you can't see in this photo behind the main building that's devoted to educational collections, the IT department, and servers. So responding to a documented desire for experiences outside the museum, they started some modest experiments with alternative practices. So they created reproductions of some of their more popular works and staged them out in the community. This is an example of this actually happening with the Detroit Institute of Arts, which has their Inside Out program, putting art out in communities outside Detroit. This one's on Mackinac Island. Responding to an increased desire on the part of millennials to rent or borrow material goods, this is what's known as the sharing economy movement or collaborative consumption, rather than owning goods. So for example, Zipcar or Uber or Lyft nowadays, or Airbnb for housing, temporary housing. The museum created a collection of paintings that they lent out on a regular basis. This started out just being local, but then they noticed the success of Zappos no-cost shipping and next-day delivery. Who loves Zappos shoe service? Yes, yay, it's fabulous. You get online, you see a shoe, you order it, and it can be there the next day. And if you don't like it, you send it back with no penalty and no shipping costs. It's awesome. So they thought, well, why don't we start doing that? Why don't we go national with our loan program? So they actually went to Tony Hsu, the founder of Zappos, and asked for advice and a partnership. And now, working with Zappos, they have loaner collections that you can get online and order that can be delivered to your door next day. They have recommendations, painting of the month you might like based on your profile of use and what you've liked in the past. So just like Zappos, 24-hour delivery, no shipping charges either way. So they started building up a big loan collection that's part of their distance education, because you could sign up for an art appreciation class, and instead of just looking at pictures in the book, you actually get the physical art to hang in your house or your classroom and work on that for a while before you return it. This is an actual loan program at the List Visual Arts Center. They loan paintings to students every semester. Okay, they started looking around and saying, well, we're pretty jazzed by the idea of having a bigger scope and reach. It was pretty cool that we could take this little community art loan program and go national with it. What else could we do? So they noticed the example of the Rijksmuseum, which Jasper Visser, our keynote speaker yesterday, called the best museum in the world. And they put the majority of their collections online as high-res digital images, and following the example of the Rijksmuseum, they made these images available for download, use, and modification, not just passively saying you can use our stuff, but actively encouraging people. And just like the Rijksmuseum said, get a tattoo of your favorite object or plaster it on your car, or make your own products and sell them. We're part of the economy that supports your work as an artist. So use our stuff, modify our stuff, create new objects for your enjoyment or for your sale. And that was a stunning success because they have their own unique collections, contributing to the world of digital resources. Well, once they started digitizing 2D images, they took the next logical step and started making 3D digital scans of the collections and putting them all online and making them available. First, they worked with local artists and hackers, just in the long tradition, 2030. This is a long tradition of art hackathons. Back in 2013, the art hackathon at the Walters Art Museum, which I'm showing here, encouraged people to scan and manipulate the museum's objects. And then they put that data out on the web in various open sources, such as MakerBot's Thingiverse, which already existed back in the 2010s and by 2030 is huge. MakerBot Academy was founded in 2013 by Bree Pettis, who also was the founder of MakerBot. And Bree Pettis in 2013 said he wanted to get 3D printers in every classroom in the U.S., and by 2030 he's managed to get them into about 80% of classrooms in the U.S., not bad. And developed a K-12 curriculum to support students creating their own art exhibits in the schools. So it's very common in 2030 for a student in a classroom to go online, find digital scans from museums, and mash up their own unique objects for their classwork, or their art project, or their science project, or their history project. So it's part of the everyday classroom curriculum that you're using digital resources from museums to create physical objects that supplement your study. And our distributed museum has become a major player in this. They're a huge source of digital scans used in the classroom. So at this point, the distributed museum staff sat down and did analysis with the board of what they were doing well, what they weren't doing so well, what were opportunities for them to really increase their scope and reach. And they decided to aggressively push their content out into the world and to own their topic, not just to be about art, but to be the go-to place on the web about art and arts education. They were inspired by the acclaimed Walker Art Center website and shift in philosophy that took place back in 2013. So about not saying, this is us, come learn about the museum, but saying, we are your guide to the world of art. Come to us when you want to learn. We're a portal. They partnered with Khan Academy on a very high-quality series of art education instructional materials. Back in 2013, 2014, Khan Academy was just beginning to dabble in the world of art education, and now with the help of the distributed museum, they have fabulous amounts of on-screen content. And yes, there are other museums playing in that space. The Getty has cooperated with Khan. American Museum of Natural History, other museums, but the distributed museum has become their main partner. They are the go-to place for arts education if you want to do online K-12 work. They also went into higher ed. Partnering with Coursera, their curators and educators started teaching massive open online courses, so-called MOOCs. Again, back in 2013, 2014, museums were just starting to experiment with this, though even very early on it was clear that this could be a big success. The MoMA teacher training MOOC on Coursera originally could only teach a couple hundred people per year when it was a physical face-to-face course. The first year they launched it, 2013, they had 17,000 people registered for the course. You're seeing an illustration right here of filming being done for the Harvard Tangible Things MOOC, much of which is filmed at or using objects from the Harvard museums. And again, that just launched, but it's turning out to be very successful with high registration. The distributed museum went into massive open online courses in a big way, and they're one of the major providers of college and graduate level courses in art education, supplemented by partnerships with museums around the country who host face-to-face discussions. Then they went really big. They said, let's just pretend anything's possible and see what we could do. So they went out with the help of some really good technologists, and they scraped and they indexed data from every other art museum, first in their city, then in other major metropolitan areas in the country, and finally around the world. And they created the ultimate museum tour app. So in 2030, they premiered an app that's the one-stop place to find what's on exhibit in this city or plan me a trip to the best works by this artist. And this actual app, which I found on the web, just locates museums in Flanders. And a similar app called Museum Locator can give you hours, prices, and websites. But I'm presuming that you actually, by 2030, building on the trend towards open data, which is everybody, governments and public organizations like museums, putting their data out in ways where it's accessible, available, and conforming to certain standards to make it easy to find and use, you could actually create the ultimate museum locator, where you not only can locate and know what's going on inside museums, but given subjects like art outside museums. So a museum can essentially curate art of the world in public spaces, whether or not it owns or controls that art. And this is what the distributed museum decides to do. They got there first. They created the ultimate museum and public art app. Then, realizing that people needed a point of entry, they needed some guidance, not just a locator, they founded the Art Mentors program. Now, this is the art equivalent of the current sharing economy programs like Vayable, which helps you find a personalized tour guide when you go to a city. So, in the Art Mentors program, you have art experts in various cities renting themselves out as expert guides. First, it started inside this museum, the distributed museum, and then any museum in the country and eventually around the world. So here's an example of a museum harnessing the sharing economy to find, vet, validate potential tour guides, and then to match them up with people who want mentoring in art. So in fact, these guys aren't just doing tours the way that Vayable is doing, they're doing art mentoring. So you can find your own personal art mentor to help you, in turn, find and use various art resources to further your art education. So the distributed museum has essentially created a worldwide network of art education with personal tutoring. So their leadership in the unification and increased accessibility of art content culminated in their spearheading the creation of the National Arts Registry program. There already is a similar tagging scheme for archaeology in the UK, where people can register and index private collections. The National Art Registry program, founded by the Distributed Museum, encourages people around the US to essentially register their privately owned art and put the data out there in a publicly accessible way, and in return for a tax break, just the way you can get a tax break for giving up easements on historic properties, by registering your art and making it available for certain periods of time for public view or available to scholars, and making the data publicly available in a searchable way, and being registered in a conservation scheme that periodically monitors its condition and gives you training on how to maintain it. So essentially they've helped to create a national collection, which is partly in private hands, but the data of which is publicly available and which is collectively cared for in the public interest. So they have moved beyond collecting and curating in just the museum storerooms to helping essentially collect and curate nationally in private houses all over the country. Okay, so now we've come to the big event of 2030 that happened to the museum. They burned down. You remember that nice building I showed you, the main building that had all the exhibits? Totally blitzed. And they got together and they cried and they wept. Luckily, nobody was hurt. And they got together and they said, what are we going to do? And you know what they decided? They decided they didn't need the building. They decided there was no reason to rebuild the physical building or try and recreate the physical collections, because with the art that they had in the loan collection, which was unhurt, and with the digital resources that they already had available, and with all of the frameworks they had built for collecting, documenting, and sharing art that they didn't own or house in this building anyway, they were already doing great work. They were having a worldwide reach. They were having phenomenal impact, and that it was no longer necessary for them to have the physical museum at the heart of all that. So they were completely online, except for the Tony, say, art loan program, which had the physical art and their reproductions. Whew. So that's our third museum, which by 2031 you couldn't actually visit physically, but you can still see online. That was our little tour. Now, I want to emphasize these three scenarios that I just told you about are not mutually exclusive alternatives. All of these kinds of museums may well exist in the future, if not to these extremes, at least as museums that look a good deal like one or the other or something else entirely. I'm hoping that what this will do is inspire your own imagination to think about how museums may evolve in the future and the many forms they may take, based on the trends you see at work today in your work, in your reading, and in what you hear today in the rest of our talks. And then when you're going back to your institution and doing your planning and choices about what you're going to focus on, consciously think about how those choices will build the museum you want to create in the future that you think is plausible. Now we have a few minutes left, and what I'm going to do is put my chat window front and center. I hadn't been reading it in detail so I could focus on talking. And I just want to kick off some discussion here with the question, which of these three museums would you rather work in? And do you have questions or concerns about any of those three potential futures that I just painted a picture of? So I know I can read your chat in the chat window, and I believe that you can also, Steve, enable your audio if you want to speak up. So let's go to some discussion.
So if you'd like to use your microphone to respond to Elizabeth, you can raise your virtual hand. It's the third icon over in the participant window, and we'll give you the microphone. To put your note in the chat, just type in the chat, the empty box at the bottom of the chat window. You can also drag that chat window out, or use the menu at the top of the chat window to detach it, and you can resize it. It makes it a little bit easier to read, and the chat doesn't fly by so much. Elizabeth, I really love those three models, and I think you obviously see them, of course. And I personally love the disconnected, almost like going to a restaurant where a chef who makes a different meal every night, and you recognize you're not at the big chain restaurant that's managing all of the data, but it's somebody who passionately cares.
Really passionately cares about their work and really pays attention to you one-on-one as a customer. I think one aspect of the disconnected museum that I love that I didn't talk about was the fact that it's a highly personalized experience. So you're not getting a one-size-fit-all visit. You're getting and choosing the musician you want to work with or the perfumier that you want to work with. So it is both something that you shape by the choices you make, and it's something where they help you create an experience very unique to you.
So are you seeing Desi's question there? The idea to have art collectors contribute their objects?
Oh, yeah, that's one I dreamt up. It doesn't actually exist now. So I think it's great, though. I'd love to figure out a way to actually promote it as a policy. That's one I made up. The nearest analogies that I have been able to make are to easements in historic properties, which I think is a reasonable analogy, and it shows how you could begin to do this. So there's a precedent. It's one of these things where I can see a precedent, I can see an impetus for it to exist, so I can imagine it actually happening. And I'm just reading some of the commentary. Notice that I'm not projecting that there's a complete disappearance of physical collections. I'm just saying that the museum might not need to own and house them. So, for example, I could be a museum and I could still find and catalog and digitize and to an extent curate physical objects that I might not own or house. And I might give people access to those either by creating exhibits in spaces that I borrow around the world. It doesn't have to be one that I permanently own and take care of. Or I could make them available in other ways by, for example, helping researchers find them when they want to do work on them, or facilitating other museums getting loans of them. So it's not a complete disconnect from physical objects. It's a different way of interacting with physical objects.
Elizabeth, for the Quantified Museum, do you think there's the same sense that ended up coming out of the total quality movement, that the more you push data down to the user and teach them how to use it, the more that they can create their own experiences versus sort of the top-down decision-making based on data? Is that a part of that vision?
I think it has to be. So here's a real example. One of the educational experiments that Bill Gates funded, and I don't have the details of this front in my memory, maybe you'll recognize it, is he essentially helped fund the creation of a firm in New York that was going to do quantified educational information for the New York public school system. And so they were going to quantify the student performance by collecting obsessive amounts of information about the kids and what they were doing and what they were learning and their test results and their homework, which totally is intellectually a sound idea, but it foundered on politics and resistance to social change because they forgot to include the parents in the early planning of this. And when the parents found out the details of the scheme, they freaked out. And they said, we think it's intrusive and inappropriate, the kinds of information that you're collecting, and we're not clear how you're going to use it and how it's going to benefit us. So in fact, the company closed down. They said, we can't do this. It's going to be impossible. That's illustrating a fact that people have documented, which is that people want to control the outcome and that you have to give people an immediate personal benefit for it to be in their interest to share data. So you, in fact, if you want to get the advantages of the emergent learning by having all this big data and say, wow, if we look at the bigger picture and the pattern of all these individual data points, we can see cool things, you have to make the individual user see some benefit from it. So I wear this because I want to know how well I'm sleeping and try and figure out how to sleep better, or to make sure I'm getting up and moving around enough during the day. But if Jawbone ever had a metadata study where they asked for my permission to say, if I strip out the personal identification, would you contribute to your data to a study of how people, working in offices can be healthier or sleep better, I'd say, sure. I'm getting a personal benefit, so I want to collect it, but I understand what you're trying to do with the bigger data, so I'm willing to donate it. Yes, it was in Bloom. Thank you very much, Blair. That was the name of the company in New York that failed because the parents got ticked off.
Well, and that doesn't even take it down to the student level, which is interesting, right? Even just to the parent level is one level. Then the actual student learning to be self-directed, learning to measure their own response to circumstances would sort of seem to me to be the ultimate goal.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this is one reason Khan Academy is working, because the kinds of interfaces that they've created where students can track their progress through a lesson and get feedback both immediately benefits the student because they're finding students are more comfortable watching the videos instead of having somebody hover over them and say, ooh, do you understand that? So they have control over the speed at which they're learning and how they review it and feedback about how they did on that and can control going back and starting over. So there's an immediate personal feedback to the student that they benefit from. There's a benefit to the teacher who can monitor how everybody's doing, seeing where they're getting stuck, and then figure out what areas need more group or individual attention. And then, of course, I think we as a society could learn a tremendous about learning by seeing the metadata that comes out of Khan.
So, Elizabeth, we like to give people a minute or two to shift gears to go from one session to the next and maybe even take a quick break. So I'm going to close this now. Thank you so much. I'm clapping. It used to be really easy to find the applause icon here, but it's a little bit more difficult. Hover over the smiley face and then go down to applause. That was terrific. I'm so excited that you are a part of this event and you've been our opening keynote. Thanks so much for the support.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to the rest of the day's proceedings.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to close now. I'll turn off the recording. We do need to have you leave the room for the recordings of the process. They'll be up within a few minutes after each session finishes. The YouTube versions of the keynotes do take a day or two to get up. Really terrific. There are 3 sessions coming up. Please look in your agenda. There's Brian Bales, Barry Joseph, and Raymond Pun. And each of those are in separate rooms. Thanks, everybody. Hope you're having a good start to the day. Bye now.